The mist over the Dutch fields did not look like the edge of history. It looked quiet, too quiet. On the morning of the 17th of September, 1944, British parachutes began opening above the Netherlands. Men dropped through the pale sky with rifles, packs, radios, medical bags, ammunition boxes, and the weight of an impossible plan strapped to their backs. Below them lay roads, woods, villages, church towers, and a bridge over the Lower Rhine at Arnhem. That bridge was supposed to open the road into Germany. That bridge was supposed to shorten the war. That bridge was supposed to be held for a short time, until British armour came racing up from the south. But war has a cruel habit of punishing plans that look perfect on a map. Within hours, the men of the British First Airborne Division were fighting not a scattered, broken enemy, but a fast-reacting German defence that understood exactly what was at stake. Roads were blocked, radios failed, units were separated, armoured vehicles appeared where light airborne troops had expected speed and surprise to carry them through. And at Arnhem Bridge, a small force under Lieutenant Colonel John Frost found itself surrounded. No easy retreat, no heavy armour, no rescue arriving on time. Just British paratroopers, glider troops, engineers, medics, signallers, and ordinary young men holding on in houses, cellars, streets, gardens, and ruins while the battle tightened around them. Arnhem did not become sacred in British memory because it was a clean victory. It became sacred because it was not. It was a defeat that revealed something more difficult than triumph. It revealed endurance. Before going deeper into this story, please take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel. It helps keep these stories of British courage, sacrifice, and national memory alive for viewers who still believe history should be told with seriousness and respect. To understand why the British powers refused to break at Arnhem, it is necessary to understand what Operation Market Garden was meant to achieve. By September 1944, Nazi Germany had suffered a crushing defeat in Normandy. Allied armies had broken out across France. Paris had been liberated. German forces were retreating, sometimes in disorder, and many Allied commanders believed that one bold stroke might end the war sooner than expected. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery proposed a daring operation. Airborne forces would seize a chain of bridges across the Netherlands. American airborne divisions would take bridges farther south. The British First Airborne Division, supported later by the 1st Independent Polish Parachute Brigade, would take the most distant and most dangerous objective, Arnhem. Then, British 30 Corps, under Lieutenant General Brian Horrocks, would push north along a narrow road, cross the bridges, reach Arnhem, and open a route into the industrial heart of Germany. On paper, it had speed, ambition, and logic. In reality, it demanded almost perfect timing. The airborne troops had to land, gather, move quickly, hold their objectives, and survive until ground forces arrived. The ground forces had to advance up a single vulnerable route, through towns, over bridges, past German guns, and under constant threat of counterattack. If one bridge fell, the road slowed. If one road was blocked, the timetable collapsed. If the enemy recovered quickly, the airborne troops at the far end would be alone. And Arnhem was the far end. The men of the British First Airborne Division were not amateurs. They were trained for the most dangerous kind of war, arriving from the sky, fighting surrounded, and holding ground before heavier forces could reach them. But airborne troops carried only what could be dropped or landed by glider. They were brave, but bravery does not stop tank shells. They were skilled, but skill does not create ammunition from empty boxes. Major General Roy Urquhart commanded the division. He was not the mythical airborne warrior of cinema. He was a professional officer, placed in command of one of the most elite formations in the British Army. The men under him were confident, disciplined, and proud of their red berets. They had every reason to believe they could do their duty. But Arnhem would test not their confidence. It would test what remained after confidence had been stripped away. The first problem was distance. The British landing and drop zones were west of Arnhem, several miles from the bridge. The choice was influenced by concerns over anti-aircraft defences, suitable landing ground, and the practical limits of airborne delivery. But the consequence was brutal. The men who needed to seize Arnhem Bridge first had to fight their way toward it. Speed was everything. Yet from the moment the first troops landed, speed began to bleed away. German forces reacted with alarming discipline. The German command in the Netherlands was not asleep. Field Marshal Walter Model, commanding Army Group B, was in the area. Elements of the 9th and 10th SS Panzer Divisions, battered after Normandy but still dangerous, were refitting nearby. These were not fresh formations at full strength, but they were experienced, hard, and quick to assemble battle groups. That matters, because the legend of Arnhem is sometimes told as if British paratroopers were unlucky because a few tanks happened to be nearby. The truth is more serious. The German forces around Arnhem were damaged, but not useless. Reduced, but not helpless. They had officers who understood airborne threats, men who had fought through years of war, and enough armoured support, guns, transport, and local command initiative to turn delay into disaster for the British. This is what makes the British stand more remarkable. They were not resisting a confused rabble.
They were resisting a capable enemy, recovering faster than the Allied timetable allowed. Lieutenant Colonel John Frost's 2nd Parachute Battalion, along with attached men from other units, pushed toward the bridge. While other British battalions met fierce resistance and became trapped or delayed on the approaches, Frost's group reached the northern end of Arnhem Road Bridge on the evening of the first day. It was a remarkable achievement, but it was also the beginning of isolation. Frost did not have the full division with him. He had a small force, roughly 700 men, holding one end of a bridge that the plan had expected a much larger force to secure. They occupied buildings near the bridge and prepared to resist. The German response came quickly. Armoured cars, infantry, guns, mortars, and tanks began probing, attacking, and squeezing the British positions. The bridge area became a furnace of smoke, brick dust, flame, and shattered glass. Houses became fortresses. Staircases became firing points. Windows became death traps. Wounded men were carried into cellars. Medical officers worked under impossible conditions. Ammunition had to be counted. Water became precious. Sleep became a luxury that belonged to another world. Yet they held. For 3 days and 4 nights, Frost's men held on around the bridge. That phrase is easy to say. 3 days and 4 nights. It sounds almost neat. But for the men inside those buildings, time did not move in days. It moved in bursts of fire, collapsing walls, shouted warnings, screams for stretcher bearers, smoke in the throat, and the terrible silence after a man beside you stopped moving. The British paratrooper at Arnhem was not an icon carved from stone. He was flesh and nerves. He was frightened, exhausted, thirsty, and often cut off from the men he expected to fight beside. His courage was not the absence of fear. It was discipline after fear had arrived. That is the heart of Arnhem. The refusal to break was not a dramatic speech. It was a man staying at his post because someone had to watch the street. It was a medic continuing to treat German and British wounded alike because humanity had not yet been shelled out of him. It was a signaller trying again with equipment that would not answer.
It was an officer making decisions with only fragments of information. It was a young soldier firing carefully because there were not enough rounds to waste. At the same time, the rest of the division was fighting a desperate battle to reach the bridge or form a defensive perimeter around Oosterbeek. Communication problems, German resistance, scattered landings, and the pressure of time turned coordination into chaos. Some British units tried to fight through Arnhem's western approaches, but German blocking forces, armoured vehicles, and prepared positions cut them down. Major General Urquhart himself was temporarily separated from his headquarters, a serious blow in a battle where command and communication were already fragile. For a time, the division's commander could not properly direct the fight. It was one more sign that the operation was slipping beyond the clean lines drawn before takeoff. And still, the men fought. The British position gradually contracted into the Oosterbeek perimeter, west of Arnhem. There, the survivors held a rough defensive pocket near the Hartenstein Hotel, which became divisional headquarters. Around them, German attacks came again and again. Shell fire tore through trees. Houses were smashed open. Trenches filled with rain, blood, and exhausted men. The perimeter was not a grand fortress. It was a wounded circle of resistance. The Germans knew the value of destroying it. The British knew the cost of surrendering it too soon. Every hour mattered, because every hour gave 30 Corps another chance to fight north. But 30 Corps was not moving through empty country. The advance from the south faced destroyed bridges, traffic jams, ambushes, German counterattacks, and the terrible vulnerability of a long column forced onto a narrow road. The road would become infamous as a corridor where progress could be measured not by ambition, but by yards gained under fire. This is where the tragedy of Arnhem deepens. The Paras were not abandoned in the simple, careless sense that memory sometimes suggests. Men were trying to reach them. British, American, Polish, and other Allied forces were fighting along the entire Market Garden route. Engineers, tank crews, infantry, pilots, and drivers were all part of the attempt. But attempt is not arrival, and at Arnhem, the difference was measured in lives. We've reached halfway, and if this story of Arnhem is already reminding you why British military memory still holds these men in such deep respect, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and write in the comments where you are watching from. Stories like this deserve to reach people who understand that history is not just dates and maps. It is sacrifice. By the third day, the battle around the bridge had become unbearable. Frost's men were surrounded in burning buildings. German attacks came from multiple directions. Tanks and self-propelled guns fired into houses at close range. British anti-tank weapons were limited. Ammunition was running low. Many of the wounded could no longer be moved. Some buildings caught fire with men still inside them. No patriotic telling of Arnhem should make this sound clean. It was horrible. The men at the bridge did not hold because victory looked certain. They held when the chances of relief were fading. They held after the plan had stopped making sense to the men living inside it. They held because the bridge was their order, their duty, and the center of the operation. Lieutenant Colonel Frost was eventually wounded. The defenders could no longer maintain their position. Those still able to fight were overwhelmed, captured, or forced into desperate attempts to withdraw. The bridge had not been held until relief arrived, but it had been held far longer than the situation should have allowed. That mattered. It tied down German forces. It shocked those who had expected airborne troops to fold once isolated. It gave the wider battle its defining image. Lightly armed British soldiers surrounded by armoured enemy forces, boosting to vanish quietly. Meanwhile, at Oosterbeek, the main body of the First Airborne Division continued to endure. The perimeter was pounded relentlessly. German troops pressed in. Supplies dropped from the air often fell into enemy hands
or landed beyond British reach. The Royal Air Force and Allied aircrews took great risks trying to deliver supplies, but weather, enemy fire, confusion on the ground, and the shrinking perimeter made success painfully limited. The men inside Oosterbeek were hungry, thirsty, and short of ammunition. Yet the line held. There were moments of individual courage that still carry weight decades later. Major Robert Kane of the South Staffordshire Regiment fought German armour at close range and later received the Victoria Cross. Captain Lionel Queripel, also awarded the Victoria Cross, showed extraordinary courage during the fighting around Arnhem. Lance Sergeant John Baskyfield destroyed enemy armour with anti-tank guns before he was killed and also received the Victoria Cross. These names matter. But Arnhem was not only a story of decorated heroes, it was also a story of men whose names never became famous. A private holding a ruined room. A glider pilot fighting as infantry after landing. A doctor refusing to leave the wounded. A Polish paratrooper crossing into a battlefield already collapsing. A Dutch civilian risking punishment to shelter or guide Allied soldiers. The 1st Independent Polish Parachute Brigade, commanded by Major General Stanislaw Sosabowski, arrived later into a situation already close to disaster. The Polish troops faced their own severe dangers and losses. Their contribution should never be treated as an afterthought. They came to help relieve the British Airborne and suffered in the same tragic struggle to keep hope alive on the far side of the Rhine. Arnhem was British memory, but it was not British memory alone. It was also Dutch memory, Polish memory, Allied memory. The Dutch people around Arnhem and Oosterbeek paid a heavy price. Homes were destroyed, civilians were killed, displaced, or forced to leave. The battle did not end their suffering. For many in the Netherlands, the failure of Market Garden meant months more under occupation, hunger, uncertainty, and fear. That is why the story must be told with humility. The courage of British soldiers does not erase the suffering of Dutch civilians. It stands beside it. By the night of the 25th of September, the decision had become unavoidable. The remnants of the 1st Airborne Division could not be left to be destroyed in place. Under cover of darkness and rain, survivors withdrew across the Rhine in Operation Berlin. Engineers and boat crews worked under fire to bring men back across the river. Not all could be saved. Some were too badly wounded to move. Some were captured. Some were already buried in the soil they had tried to liberate. Of the roughly 10,000 British airborne troops who had landed near Arnhem, only a little over 2,000 made it back across the Rhine. The losses were devastating. British and Polish airborne dead and those who died of wounds numbered nearly 1,500, and thousands more became prisoners of war. The 1st Airborne Division had fought with astonishing endurance, but it had been shattered as a fighting formation. Operation Market Garden failed to achieve its final objective. Arnhem was, in the famous phrase popularized later, a bridge too far. But that phrase can be misunderstood. It can make the operation sound like a lesson in foolishness alone, as if the men who fought there were simply victims of a plan too ambitious for reality. The truth is more painful and more honorable. The plan was bold. It was flawed. It depended on speed, surprise, and a ground advance that could not afford delay. Allied intelligence had warnings about German strength in the area, but the full danger was not appreciated in time or acted upon with enough caution. Historians still debate the balance between audacity and overconfidence, but once the battle began, the men on the ground did not have the luxury of debating history. They had orders, they had comrades, they had wounded beside them, they had a bridge, a perimeter, and a duty that outlived the plan. This is why British paras refused to break at Arnhem. Not because they believed themselves invincible, Not because they thought courage could magically defeat artillery and tanks. They refused to break because airborne training had taught them to act when surrounded. Because British discipline often expresses itself not in loud words, but in quiet obedience under impossible strain. Because the men beside them were watching. Because to run too soon would expose others. Because every hour mattered. Because even in defeat, there is a way for soldiers to preserve honour. Arnhem became a wound in British military memory, but it also became a standard. A reminder that the measure of a fighting force is not only whether it wins when everything goes right. It is what it does when the map is wrong, the radios fail, the enemy is stronger than expected, the ammunition is low, and rescue does not come on time. At Arnhem, the British Paras showed that defeat and disgrace are not the same thing. They lost the bridge. They did not lose their name. In the years after the war, veterans returned to the Netherlands. They stood by graves at Oosterbeek. Dutch children laid flowers. Families remembered men who never came home. The red beret became more than part of a uniform. It became a symbol of men who had gone too far into danger and held on longer than reason demanded. There is a quiet British sadness in Arnhem. It is not the sadness of shame, it is the sadness of cost. The kind felt when a nation remembers that freedom was bought not by speeches, but by young men burning in houses, freezing in trenches, rowing across dark rivers, and lying in foreign fields under white stones. That is why Arnhem still matters to Britain, because it refuses to let courage be measured only by victory, because it reminds the British people that some of the most sacred stories are not the ones where everything succeeds. Sometimes the deepest pride comes from the men who stood in the ruins and did their duty anyway. They were not rescued in time. They were not given an easy battlefield. They were not spared the consequences of command decisions made far above them. But they held. At the bridge, at Oosterbeek, in the cellars, in the burning streets, beside the wounded, under shell fire, until there was almost nothing left to give. Britain's strength has often looked quiet from the outside. It has looked like restraint, understatement, patience, and stubbornness. But at Arnhem, that quiet strength became something harder. It became a refusal to collapse when collapse would have been understandable. That is the legacy of the British Paras at Arnhem. Not victory in the ordinary sense, something rarer, a defeat remembered with reverence, because the men inside it behaved as if duty still mattered when hope was almost gone. If you watched until the end, write the word Arnhem in the comments. It tells me you stayed with the story to the final moment, and it honours the men who held the line when the bridge was already becoming legend.